So today we're going to be working on an iPhone XR. It came in for boot looping. The shop said they tried to potentially update it and it ended up with error 4013. This could be memory related, it could be CPU related, it could be so many reasons, but this is a little different than the older devices. Typically error 4013 can mean a plethora of different things on the newer series. So we're going to dive right in, we're going to troubleshoot this issue, and we're going to try to see if we can unfold the mystery. So the device is pretty much in a state of just boot looping constantly. I have a general idea based off experience what this potentially could be, but what I like to do is essentially disconnect each flex one by one until the Apple logo no longer reboots. So instead of assuming it's going to be a NAND related issue or a CPU related issue, the first thing I like to do is just disconnect the Face ID flex from the motherboard. So we'll disconnect the cable from the FPC. We'll power this device on and we'll check if we still have the same symptomatic issue with the Apple logo being frozen on the boot screen. Now that we have our cable disconnected and tucked off to the side, we're going to go ahead and boot this up. Let's go ahead and get this powered on and let's see if there's any difference. All right, so we've got an Apple logo. Usually after about 3 to 4 seconds, you would see it reboot right away. So it looks promising so far. And voila. So we do have a full boot and we are able to boot to the lock screen. So I believe that this issue is going to be Face ID related. I'm going to show you guys how I go about fixing that issue right now. But essentially without the Face ID flex, it's going to go ahead and turn on. So that's the good news. So let's proceed with the repair. So as you can already tell, there's some signs of liquid damage, as indicated by kind of like a splash mark, and then we've got a bit of corrosion right here on this screw post. So these are dead giveaways. So we've got this much amount of corrosion on the screws. We can imagine that the flood illuminator is going to have some corrosion as well, and that's what's going to be causing that constant boot loop. So our goal here today is to take the flood illuminator off and have a look under the actual pads, because if there's any kind of high level of oxidation that's going on under there, that will definitely cause that issue. So there it is. We're able to spot it right away. So essentially we have a bunch of corrosion in between the solder joints, which is definitely affecting the communication lines that's sending signal for the Face ID circuit. This is going to be your ALS. This is going to be your ambient light sensor. And this component here is the flood illuminator. So with this amount of corrosion, the best practice is to actually go ahead and pick this up, clean in between both layers actually, and then go ahead and resolder everything back down. So let's go over the process of prepping this, prepping the pads, and then going ahead and adding some new solder to it, and then taking a look at the damage. Depending on the level of damage, if the damage is very extensive, it's actually recommended just to go ahead and replace this this flex, because this flex is it's not paired. So the flex itself is not paired to Face ID. What I'm referring to is this part. So the flex that I'm referring to is this guy right here. It's a long flex that runs all the way to the FPC connector, And basically we have to determine if when we lift these two components, if the pads are so far gone, then it's a better idea to just go ahead and replace the flex. The flex is it's very cheap. It's maybe $5-10, depending on the vendor that you purchase it from. So we'll have to come to a deciding point where if we lift these two components up and everything looks fine, just a little bit of oxidation, we can scrape that off with a number 11 blade, and we can freshen it up with a little bit of flux and solder. But if it's way too far gone, then we do have the option to replace this flex right here. What goes to south of the flex is the speaker. North of the flex is going to be your ambient light sensor, flood illuminator, and this component over here, which I think it's like a speaker or noise cancellation of some sorts. But let's go ahead and dive further in, and let's take a look at the health of the solder pads that are under these two components. So there's definitely different methods of removal, but today we're going to use a preheater. We're going to let this warm up, and then we'll take each sensor off one by one. First we'll start with the flood illuminator, and then we'll flip this over and take off the ambient light sensor. So it just takes a few minutes for this to reach its target temperature, and then we'll go ahead and remove these sensors and take a look at the pads. All right, so let's go ahead and get this on top of this preheater. I like to add a little bit of flux right over towards the bottom of the sensor. And for this method, I'm going to be using two sets of tweezers, or a set of tweezers rather. I'm going to hold down until the sensor is ready just to give. You can, to kind of gauge it, we could essentially tap it from time to time. And when you bump it and it kind of moves back, that means it's reached the desired temperature to go ahead and lift up. So we got to give it a moment with this preheater, being very careful not to burn the ambient light sensor. Just a little bit longer, and we'll be able to go ahead and desolder this flood illuminator. So I don't like using heat because this plastic that's pretty much the housing or the casing for the flood illuminator, it seems to be like a very low density plastic, so it tends to burn very fast. But on a preheater, there it is. On a preheater, it just seems to actually work out a little bit better. So I'll set this to the side, and then I'll grab the bottom portion. I'll add a little bit more flux, and we'll just grab this bottom portion. Typically on XRs, I wouldn't remove both layers, but with this level of oxidation, definitely it's a great idea to go ahead and grab both. So it's taking a little longer for the bottom layer to come up. Let's set the temperature about maybe 10 degrees higher, and then let's give it a try. Let's give it one more try. So there we are. Let's just see when it's ready. We're gonna lift it. Okay, so it came up in one piece. Just took a little longer than usual, I guess due to the level of oxidation. We're gonna flip this over, and we're going to remove the ambient light sensor. I like to hold this cable where it doesn't move as much. A little tricky on a preheater. On a cable that's really flimsy, so we'll heat it up just a bit. And we'll go ahead and, let me rotate this, and we'll go ahead and grab this bad boy. Being very patient, there we go. We have the flood illuminator, we have its spacer, which the spacer is this guy right here, and then we have the ambient light sensor. I'm going to just flip this over and take a quick peek and see what it looks like. So not that bad, not as bad as I thought it would look, right? But sometimes like the flux and just the temperature tends to make it look cleaner than what it actually is. So I'm gonna go ahead and just flip this guy over real quick. Make it this a little sharper for you guys. I'm gonna flip this ambient light sensor over, and then we're just gonna take a peek at the pads on the bottom. And yeah, so this is definitely in decent shape. And we'll go ahead and prep these 3 components, and we'll see if let me take one more look at the flex. Pretty decent, pretty good. I would definitely reuse this. We're not really dealing with missing any solder mask, which is great. Just a little bit over here. Let's take a look at the flood illuminator side. We just have a little bit of the mask that came up, just a little bit. We'll go ahead and clean this up. We'll add some new solder to it, and then we'll go ahead and solder everything back on. So essentially, we're going to be replacing all of the solder from the pads on the flex cable, flood illuminator, ambient light sensor with 148 paste. So we'll go ahead and add some flux and some solder paste so we can completely change the composition of the alloy. So I pretty much want to focus on the pads. And on this type of flex, since it's a little bit more delicate, I don't like to run my iron up and down, so to speak, because the mass that's on this actual pad it's very weak. So we'll add a little bit more solder. Then the whole idea right here is just changing the composition, changing the alloys. That's good enough for me. From this point, I go ahead and use a little bit of hot air so that we could go ahead and wick this off. Now, there's pretty much 2 forms of wicking. There's wicking with an iron, and it's definitely not recommended on this type of flex cable. That's very delicate. So I'm gonna go ahead and use a little bit of hot air, and I'm just gonna brush off the existing solder. So let me go ahead and set my air, and then we can grab a little piece of solder wick so we can essentially just brush off that solder. And that's it. Go ahead and clean this up with a little bit of alcohol. I just like to tap. I don't rub, because as this starts to dry, you're really gonna start to see how weak this little cable is. The texture that's on the mask. On a motherboard, you have real solder mask, protecting the layers. But here, I feel like it's just like a piece of paper between the grooves, and the paper doesn't like alcohol too much. Starts to bubble up. The paper doesn't like heat. It may not be referred to as literally paper, but it just doesn't seem like it's the same type of solder mask that's on a motherboard. But nonetheless, we have all of the potential areas clean, and to just go ahead and fix this little copper strip which was exposed. A little bit of UV mask, not too much. This should be fine, right around that amount. Kind of let it flow and solidify on its own. And that should be enough. We will do the same for the ambient light sensor. Just a little bit of flux, a little bit of solder. I like to focus on heating up the wick first. And that's it. A little bit of alcohol. Let me just tap. Also like to roll as well. I'll use the roll method versus the scrubbing back and forth. As you can see, like this flex gets like a little bubbly, so that's my reason behind it. So we'll dry this a little bit with a clean room wipe. You can even add a little bit of alcohol on the clean room wipe and just press down, and then use the dry side. That way we're not disturbing the this delicate flex right here. Okay, moving on to the flood illuminator. So one of the ways that I like to avoid getting flux inside of the sensor is putting a couple pieces of clean room wipe on the bottom of the actual, on the surface of my work area. So the part that we like to avoid, and if it's okay if a little bit of flux gets inside. I haven't had any issues, but I just know it's, you just want to try to avoid it at all cost. So we don't want it to get inside of this lens over here. This is the point that kind of looks at your face during the Face ID process. That's going to be using its biometric system to authenticate your face. So we'll go ahead and flip it back over as we're going to continue prepping it. I'm going to put a little bit of clean room wipe down, and then we're just going to push down a little bit. So that way, when all the residual flux starts spilling over towards the side, we won't have to worry about it going straight into the sensors. That's one of my tricks. So let's go ahead and put a little bit of flux. Same process, we're going to continue prepping each and every individual component that is necessary to restore functionality and to get rid of the potential boot looping issue. So we'll move this to the center, and then we will add a little bit of solder to it. And that should be enough. I like to push down from one side, and just here it's a stronger surface, so you could actually drag solder if you needed to. And we'll continue to just move our iron around. And as you see, all the residual flux is kind of like leaning off towards the side. So for this particular method, I am going to use a piece of wick to go ahead and remove the, see, let me show you. You don't have like a bunch of flux in the sensor. So that's definitely, it's a good idea to grab a couple clean room wipes. So we'll move it towards another location, because that location is already has a bit of flux that's kind of spilt over to the clean room wipe. And let's go ahead and wick this, and then we will reball this. We'll just add a little bit more flux. Not too much, we don't need a lot. And then grab a small piece of wick. We'll just wick right over it. So it doesn't require an extensive amount of time with wicking. You can just pretty much tap it and it's wicked. So we will clean this as best as possible. Anytime you're going to reball a chip or an IC, you do not want to continue working with burnt flux. Take my advice on that. It would just make the process, either not work or just you're gonna notice that your solder, your process is not working out for you. So let me go ahead and clean it up just a little bit more. And then we can go ahead and grab our stencil. And then we have different series for different Face ID modules, flood illuminator modules. And we will go ahead and reball this real quick. You just line this up like so, wipe down this general area to get it as clean as possible. Grabbing a little bit of paste, and always a good idea to dry your paste. So I'm gonna get a little bit of paste on my spatula, and then I'm going to dry my paste just a little bit. So I like to just take a little clean room wipe and squeeze it. I'll go for the first pass and then the second time. You don't need a lot of paste, but this is my method of making sure the reball comes out way easier. So let's go ahead and add some paste to our stencil. Focus on the alignment as best as possible. That seems pretty centered right there. Let's go ahead and add some paste. Don't need much, so that's probably about as much as we need right there. Grab the hot air. That's it. Wait for it to cool. Move all this extra solder balls out the way. And that's it. That's all we need. So we'll push this out the stencil, and we'll take a look at it and give it a quick reflow. So that seems like the optimal amount of paste that we needed. So we will, again, just sit this close to the clean room wipe. And what this stencil actually helps is, when I used to do this by hand, when you're just soldering it by hand, if the problem with this Face ID repair, if you get this pad right here too high, you won't have a connection with the outer pads. So that's something to definitely avoid, and that's why I started to lean more towards using a stencil during this process. So we will just add a little bit of flux. Get a nice, even, saturated amount of flux that's on there. And then we will grab our hot air. I like to push the chip down from the center. That's it. All right. That's about as much as we need. So even at this point, we're still gonna clean it. Notice that this pad is not too high, so that's going to definitely work out for us. We have enough that's on there that it's going to be able to solder on there, so not really worried about it. Let's go ahead and clean this up. All right, that's clean enough for me. Let's go ahead and set this. Get these little stray strings of Q-tips out the way. And we have the ambient light sensor, which we're just going to run a little solder through just to clean it up. Now this sensor, I won't reball it. I'll just have enough, solder that's needed for us to sit it down so we can align it and just flow it into place. So, but you can kind of see a little bit of the corrosion. If we really like zoom in and you really pay attention, some of the gray stuff that you see, like for instance, like over here, that's oxidation, that's corrosion, and most of the brown stuff that you see is going to be a little bit of corrosion as well. Some of it is just flux, but a lot of it is corrosion, as seen on a previous clip earlier on in the video. So let's go ahead and add a little bit of flux and a little bit of solder. So we'll hold our sensor, push down so we can get everything aligned, and add some solder to it. And that's it. That's all we pretty much need. We can go ahead and clean this off now. Having a final look and making sure that everything is pretty much the same height. If I'm not comfortable with it, I will go over it again. But it's best to clean, because when you have flux, it does create like this illusion that some balls are smaller and some balls are bigger. It's hard to explain. So everything looks the same height to me. We'll take one more last look at it, and I would say that's a good even amount. Yeah, that's fine right there. Okay, so we've got that ready. Now this is a good example. This is the spacer. This was the part that went in between. So I do see, anytime you see something dark gray, towards this degree, this is going to be like a little bit of, it's going to be oxidation. And it seems, now that I'm looking at it, it looks like there's a higher level of oxidation that was in the middle spacer versus the bottom of the flood illuminator. So we'll add some flux to this and we'll clean it up and we'll make it look pretty. So now that we have all three of our components ready to be resoldered back down to the flex, we just want to double check. We've got our flood illuminator, which is basically responsible for Face ID, and then we have our spacer. So the bottom of the spacer is reballed, the bottom of the flood illuminator, it's reballed, so that's going to go on a flat surface. So, and then we've got our ambient light sensor, which we added enough solder to it. We added enough solder to it so that where we could just sit it down and it's going to solder itself back in place with the right amount of alignment. So let me just clean this chip up on the back, on the opposite side real quick. I don't like to deal with any burnt flux or anything like that. So always try to be as clean as possible when you're doing these repairs. Any repair pretty much that has to do with like a BGA chip. You want to be as clean as possible. So we'll go ahead and get our flex ready. So we'll scoot to this corner, zoom out, get it a little clear, and we're going to start off with our spacer. So our spacer is definitely the first thing that needs to go down onto the flex. We will add a little bit of flux to this flex. I'm going to make sure it's clean, so I'm going to just grab just a little bit more alcohol. and make sure that we have the cleanest work area as possible. There we go. Okay. So let's get this sit this down where we can control it. And we basically have our flex on here. And we will put a baby amount of flux. That's more than enough. And we will sit down our spacer. So the first guy that goes on is the spacer. We will try to line it up a little bit off of the preheater first. Here we go. We will line it up off of the preheater first. We will sit this down. So if you're just paying attention to the way that it goes, you could put it either way that backwards, but it can end up the wrong way towards the top. So make sure that this big window towards the bottom, let me zoom in so you guys could really see it, excuse me. And make sure this window towards the bottom is actually towards the bottom of the flex. This one right here I'm referring to. So just make sure this guy right here is just sitting as best as you can. As long as you have it aligned, for the most part, it will go back into place. So just try to get the best alignment that you possibly can, and then we will go ahead and focus on getting this sensor on this corner of the preheater, and then we will make sure that all of the sensors, one by one, are pretty much gonna flow into place. So we will scoot this over just a little bit, and we will just wait for it. We push down ever so slightly, and that one is ready. You can move it away, let it cool down. All right, now that we have that middle spacer on there, let's go ahead and put the flood illuminator on. So we'll go ahead and add just a little bit of flux to move this over. We'll go ahead and add a little bit of flux just to the top of the sensor. We don't need much. And then we will go ahead and get this ready. So we're just gonna go off the preheater, we're gonna set it up, we're gonna align it as best as possible. And then we have a decent amount of flux, and that sensor for the most part is aligned. We could probably, I'm gonna push this up so you guys can see it, we could probably push it over just a little bit, but it looks aligned to me. So we're gonna scoot it over, kind of gotta sneak up on it, you gotta scoot it over just a little bit so that it could solder itself back together. So just give it a little time. It should solder itself back in place. There you go, it popped into place. Slide it off slowly, and then we can just wait for it to cool off. You want to be as gentle as possible because we're actually dealing with lower melting temperatures. So the last part is going to be the ambient light sensor, which we have right here. We can scoot this guy over towards this corner, and then we can add just a little bit of flux, and then we will go ahead and make sure everything is working properly. So we will set this, we will set it on as close as possible to its alignment off the preheater. and then you want to slide it onto the preheater. So I'll twist this to the side, because as I'm literally just going to slide it on there, and it's pretty much going to solder itself. So get the best alignment possible. Just take your time with your alignments. Definitely never a rush. You get it done right the first time, you're done. All right, so I'm gonna set this on here and I'm just gonna drop it. I'm gonna push down just a little bit. It's gonna align itself. Pay attention how it's gonna shift north. I could adjust it just a little bit. I'm going to add just a little bit more flux in between the space. And we're going to sit it down one more time to make sure that it actually solders really well. That's it. It's soldered on. Push down. Leave it on there. Now start to roll off slowly. So we'll go ahead and clean these sensors up with a little bit of alcohol, and we'll take a look under the microscope really close. Let's take a look at the connections as best as possible. I want to fold this up and make sure that we have a good solid connection. So let's zoom in, and it looks like we have a good solid connection. Just got to go ahead and clean this up just a little bit to get a better view. But for the most part, I see that everything is sitting flat where it needs to be, and shouldn't have any issues. So I see that you can see the solder connection within every surface. So let's go ahead and push some of this out, alcohol. And we can see the solder connections right there. Let's look at the ambient light sensor, and everything is making a solid connection. So let's go ahead and get this connected. All right, so up until this point, we have the Face ID connector connected right back into the motherboard, and then we just need to go ahead and push this battery down so we can go ahead and test everything out. So let's push this battery down, and let's go ahead and prompt it to boot, and let's see if the device is still rebooting. All right, we've got an Apple logo. Let's see if it's going to reboot, or if we can make it all the way to the lock screen. And there you go, no more rebooting. So essentially just had to go through the whole process of reballing that flood illuminator, the spacer, and the ambient light sensor. And this phone is no longer rebooting due to corrosion in between the components. So this is a very common issue. We're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna double check. I may have a passcode, I may not have a passcode, but I'm gonna go ahead and try to get the passcode so we can test Face ID. So the device is up and running. We weren't able to obtain the passcode, but nonetheless the device is no longer rebooting. So I'm pointing at this ear speaker mesh just to kind of let you guys know and to indicate to most of you viewers that the most common issue that we're experiencing is water finding its way into the ear speaker mesh. Now, although it's water resistant, it's not considered waterproof. So this is a very common issue that we are having. So if you're a shop, if you're a repair shop owner, or you're a technician and you've just gotten, you got Error 4013, just be a little careful because it's not always Face ID. It could be the NAND. I've seen it be issues related to like a charge port, and it also can be related to the CPU. So it just depends. But what we like to do here, in a case-by-case scenario, is open up the phone, do a visual inspection, and just start with our process of elimination until we get to the bottom of it. So we unmasked the mystery of why this phone was boot looping, and it was constantly stuck at the Apple logo, reboot. It all had to do with the Face ID system that resides north of the phone that sits right behind the LCD screen. So if you have an issue like this and you need us for services, just look at the links in the description down below. We have our Facebook link where you can send us a DM. We do offer mail-in repairs. Thanks for sticking through all the way to the end of the video. I hope you guys learned something, and I will see you guys next week with another awesome video. Later.